A very good morning to you all and welcome. First of all, just to say I'm very glad you've made it, given all of the weather, the train chaos. Many of you made significant efforts to get here, not to mention people who've come over from Washington, D.C. So just a word of, just to express my gladness that you've actually made it and that we can be here together. This conference of the Christian Literary Imagination is a wonderful collaboration, and Georgetown University, with President DeJoy's support, have supported this conference. So we're working together with them and Campion Hall, which is the Jesuit Permanent Private Hall in the University of Oxford, and Blackfriars Hall, which is the Dominican Hall. It's a nice coincidence that we've both been celebrating anniversary years. So the Blackfriars, Campion Hall, 125 years as a permanent private hall in the university. The Dominicans have been in Oxford for 800 years, or at least, so we can't quite compete with that. Although we do have a conference on 400 years of the English province of the Jesuits next year. So we're very much the younger sibling, but it's great that two Jesuit institutions, Georgetown and Campion Hall, working together with a Dominican institution, especially in this anniversary year. A word of thanks to Mike Scott and to Maggie, to Joe Simmons, and to Vanessa Hack at Campion Hall, many others who have been working very hard on the program and have put together this very interesting conference. So congratulations, Mike, on all that work. And we had a wonderful seminar yesterday for postgraduates and early career researchers, and that already the conversation is bubbling away. So I look forward to how it develops today. And thanks also to those who are going to be presenting, who've put significant work into preparing their talks. Good, so I'll just now hand over to Tom Banchoff, who's the Vice President for Global Engagement at Georgetown University. So Tom, there you go. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you here, and I want to echo Father Nick Austin's words of welcome. On behalf of Georgetown, on behalf of our president, Dr. John J. DeJoy, who's with us today, and on behalf of our entire university community, I want to underscore how delighted we are to be part of this conference, to be part of this collaboration with Campion Hall and with Blackfriars Hall around this important and timely, always timely topic of the Christian literary imagination. I thought I'd just give a little background about how we got to this point. As many of you know, this conference is a culmination of a series of events around the Christian literary imagination that goes back to the heart of the pandemic, October 2020. We began with the first of a long series of Zoom seminars taking us through this topic, through the centuries, right up to today. I did a little research online. I counted 28 Zoom seminars in just 2 years, which is quite amazing. One of the blessings, if one can say that, of the pandemic is our discovery of this technology, which has really allowed us to be connected, to stay connected in so many ways. They all began at the same time, which is quite interesting. 11 a.m. UK, or rather 11 a.m. US, to allow for full participation on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's been a wonderful series, and it's wonderful to have this opportunity now as we move out of the pandemic slowly and unevenly to continue this conversation in person. As you've heard, as you know from the program, we've got excellent scholars, but also rising young scholars who've been with us for these couple of days, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you this afternoon and into the early evening. I want to also share a couple of words of thanks for Mike Scott's incredible energy as a connector, as a great scholar, but also as a connector, a collaborator, who's brought together these three institutions, Georgetown University, Campion Hall, and Blackfriars. Thanks to Maggie Scott for her organizational acumen, to Father Nick Austin, Campion Hall, the leadership team there. As was mentioned, Georgetown and Campion Hall are two Jesuit institutions. We've had a rich collaboration for more than a decade now, and we look forward to pursuing that collaboration into the future. So that's it from me. I want to turn it back over to Mike Scott to say a bit about the first panel. So please join me in welcoming Mike Scott back to the podium.
Thanks very much. I think we ought to just get on with this. So I'd ask Claire Broom Saunders to come up to introduce our first speaker. Hope you have a good conference.
Good morning. It's my very great pleasure to welcome back to Oxford Dr. Bonnie Lander-Johnson, who is a Fellow of Downing College, Cambridge. Her books on Renaissance literature include Chastity in Early Stuart Literature and Culture, Blood Matters, The Cambridge Handbook to Literature and Plants, and Botanical Culture and Popular Belief in Shakespeare's England. She also writes widely on 20th century Catholic novelists, and with Julia Mazzaros edits for the CUA Press the series Catholic Women Writers. Bonnie is also a fiction and non-fiction writer whose work has been shortlisted for the V.S. Pritchett Prize, the BLB Short Story Award, and the Pushcart Prize. Her paper today looks at literary form and Christian imagination. Will you please join me in welcoming her?
Thank you, Claire. How's the sound? I think the mic is here near my hand, so I'll be careful not to touch it too much. It's wonderful to be here in the Oxford Chaplaincy. It was here many years ago when I was a doctoral student living upstairs in one of those rooms with the wonky floors that I met my good friend and colleague Julia Mazzaros. She was also a doctoral student. She was working on literature in the theology department, and I was working on church history in the English department. And we often met here and at the Bear across the road and talked about our love of literature and of prose fiction in particular because of its unique capacity to articulate the experience of the Christian life as it's lived out in the world. And we used to regret that there weren't more of these wonderful novels that we loved to read. I think at the time we assumed, like many readers, that the list of such novels was rather short. Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene are the obvious writers that come to mind. We then finished our doctorates and went off and started academic careers and families and busy lives. And it's a testimony to the importance of university chaplaincies that we never lost touch with each other. Despite our busy lives, we always made time to come together and talk about our love of literature. And then this shared interest turned into a research project. We were convinced that there must surely be a lot more of the sorts of novels that we loved out there. And so we did a little digging and were surprised to find not only that there are, in fact, hundreds of really great Christian novels, many of them specifically Catholic, that have fallen out of print, but actually that many of these books were by women. To give you an example of one such writer, Josephine Ward, she lived through the second half of the 19th century and then into the first half of the 20th century. She died in the 1930s, but she was a Victorian by generation. She was the first generation after the re-establishment of the church hierarchy and was very, very active in helping to re-establish in Britain a literate, culturally and theologically literate Catholic community. So she moved in the same circles and was very involved in the theological world. She was a very good friend of Newman. He used to come to her house to catechize her children, and they would share ideas about their work. But she was also a good friend of Tennyson, so she straddled both of those two worlds. She used to be on the lecture circuit, which is really phenomenal for a 19th century woman. She wrote 10 very, very fine novels, while she was having her 5 children. The novels were very well received. Some of them were bestsellers. They were all explicitly Catholic, but they were very welcome in the fin de siècle literary readership. They all then fell out of print after the Second World War, even though she had by then helped her daughter Maisie Ward to set up Sheedon Ward, the first modern Catholic publishing house with offices in London and New York. And then she disappeared from the historical record almost completely. She didn't until this year have an entry in the ODNB. She has one now because I've written one for her. But that's the level of cultural amnesia that we're actually talking about with some of these women. So Julia and I began a multi-volume series of novels called Catholic Women Writers with CUA Press. We're bringing out 2 paperbacks every year. The volumes contain introductions that are written in an accessible style but grounded in scholarship, comparable in tone to an Oxford Classics introduction, but providing what's always been missing for me from Oxford Classics, which is an attention not just to the literary and historical merits of the novel, but also an attention to its theological concerns. So today I want to talk to you about some of the things that we found when we went looking for these lost novels. And I'm also going to talk to you from my perspective as an academic literary critic about some of the ways that these novels were innovating the novel form to create a particular experience of the Christian life for their readers. So these are novels that used and developed some of the most radical literary techniques of their time, but they did so in specifically theological ways. They're novels that require of literary critics a theological ear, but they also require that theologians have an eye for literary technique. Okay, so in the British Isles, we usually think of the Catholic literary revival as a movement that lasted from around 1900 to 1960, a movement concentrated in the south of England, in which Catholic writers began to produce fiction, especially novels, that articulated the unique conditions of being a British Catholic so shortly after the re-establishment of the church hierarchy. We usually consider this fiction to have grown out of that historical window when Catholics were just beginning to emerge back into the public sphere, but were still marginal enough that they possessed a position of significant difference within society, which seems to be a quite fruitful place for an artist to be on the edges of society. So the movement is usually associated with the work of G.K. Chesterton, Evelyn Waugh, Graham Greene, novels that focus on the solitary figure of a priest or layman in spiritual combat with the world around him. But in fact, the revival's most numerous members were women, many of whom have been forgotten. And when we put these women back into the frame, we find that the revival actually is quite different than the definition that I just gave you. We see that Catholic novels were being written much earlier and much later than we thought. And we see that the revival's writers were located in all areas of Britain and Ireland, not merely in the south of England. Many novels by Catholic women are also, in a theological and a literary sense, quite different from those of Waugh and Greene. They're often situated in families and in villages, and in the institutional communities in which the writers themselves first encountered the faith, schools, convents and convent schools, almost wholly unrecognised by scholarship of the Catholic novel or of the novel generally, are the frequent depictions of female religious life in 20th century novels. So it does remain strange that these women have fallen out of print, but less strange is the fact that they were the revival's earliest voices. The novel was always primarily a female or feminized genre. There are, of course, numerous very prominent counterexamples, Richardson and Fielding, Dickens and Wilde, but it remains true that from its earliest emergence in the 18th century, the novel was a genre written overwhelmingly by women, and one that frequently explored the internal lives of female characters and their negotiation of personal relationships within the more limited geographical setting of a single house, village, or city. The novel is also a genre well suited to the exploration of social and political change. Unlike most pre-modern literary forms, the novel can provide a voice for those who do not possess great social power, who must navigate moral and political challenges on their own, and often in direct conflict with the culture around them. and who in doing so offer criticisms of their society. And in this respect, the novel did actually offer a really good vehicle for exploring the challenges faced by a Catholic in the modern world. So, Carol Houselander lived in the first half of the 20th century. She was a mystic, a visionary, a writer, and an artist. She wrote copious volumes of spiritual literature, both prose and verse. And then she was, for many years, Sheed and Ward's highest-selling author. During the end of her life, she wrote one novel, The Dry Wood, in 1947, which after 1960 fell out of print for a long time. The Dry Wood is set in post-war London Docklands parish. It follows a number of different characters in the parish, from the Archbishop himself, who was once a Docklander, to the parish priest, lay people both observant and barely observant, to people who are not Catholics but are living on the sort of fringes of parish life. And each of these characters are given their own chapter, and although many of them do not collide with each other, we see their stories drawn together by two events: the death of their saintly priest, who they all mourn, and their collective hope for the miraculous healing of a vulnerable child in the parish, whose gentleness in the face of suffering brings conversion to them all in unexpected ways. And these two situations are connected because the parishioners begin to pray for their dead, they pray to their dead priest for the miraculous healing of the child. So we see their collective yearning for, on the one hand, the preservation of the child's life and confirmation that the priest is saintly. And I'm going to try and talk about the novel in such a way as not to spoil for you those two narrative desires and their outcome. So the structure of this novel can be understood both as a form of overlooked modernist literary innovation and as a way of thinking about the poetics of liturgy and the relationship between liturgy and narrative form or narrative fiction. The novel's narrative voice is third person, but each chapter follows a different character with a high degree of psychological proximity. The third person voice isn't quite omniscient, except for specific moments. Instead, it stays very close to each individual character, but moves in each chapter through different points of view. So we see the characters, but they don't really see each other. And this is a narrative strategy that was an innovation of the 20th century. It was a reaction against the 19th century novel, which usually followed one character, and when it did follow a group, it did so through the omniscient voice. So 20th century literary modernism questioned two bedrocks of the 19th century novel. One, its addiction to the individual, its trust in the individual consciousness as a distinct locus of moral adventure. And two, it also questioned the omniscient voice because of its alliance with a totalizing moral order, whether that was understood as divine or instead as providential or even a punitive agent of social or moral justice. So modernist responses to individualism and the omniscient voice often reacted against what they saw as a Protestant bourgeois providentialism. And they did so by instead devising a narrative structure that moved the novel in more political or secular directions. Now, as a Catholic novelist, Houselander was also reacting against the bourgeois providentialism of the 19th century novel, but unlike her atheist peers, she did so by amplifying in her novel the mysterious operations of the divine presence. Now, other Catholic writers would follow her in this. Graham Greene later rejected the Christianity of Dickens, characterising it as a woman serving soup to the poor. And Dorothy Sayers said, "It is hopeless to offer Christianity as a vaguely idealistic aspiration of a simple and consoling kind. It is, on the contrary, a hard, tough, exacting and complex doctrine steeped in a drastic and uncompromising realism." A lot of unforgiving adjectives there. But I really like this idea of a drastic realism in this context because, of course, what we're talking about is the social realist novel of the first half of the 20th century, which was usually so this-worldly, and that's what it meant to be the realist novel, to be this worldly. But of course, what we're looking at in this series are realist novels that are otherworldly or divine as well. And I think there's a way that we need to readjust how we understand the social realist novel in light of these women. So Houselander's answer to the Protestant novel was to deepen the genre's capacity for articulating the divine. But, and this is where I think she's so interesting, unlike other Catholic novelists, she depicted the divine presence through narrative strategies that were in fact more in line with those of other atheist novelists. She's using the most innovative secular techniques to enable a fuller Christian vision of the world. Now, Houselander was often in the company of other Christians, especially Catholics, who were suspicious of modernism in its broadest sense. She didn't share those views. Of modernist writers, she said, they are not the contemptible egoists which they are too often supposed to be. So the precise structuring work that Houselander brings to her novel suggests that she was engaging very closely with the work of modernist literary peers, and in fact, I think she was looking specifically at a genre of novel that emerged in the UK and America in the 1930s, which is itself often overlooked. You tell me if you've read any of these or if they were ever offered to you on the undergraduate curriculum, perhaps they were. This is a genre called the collective novel. These are novels in which individual characters, again, we meet individual characters in their own chapter, but they very rarely collide. And when they do, they usually fail to make any meaningful contact at all. John Summerfield's 1936 socialist novel called Mayday is a prime example of the collective novel in Britain. And in America, the trilogy called USA by John Dos Passos was written in the same decade. Although these are held up as kind of examples of the collective novel, we also see in the decade before, 1925 was Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf and James Joyce's Ulysses in the 20s as well. And these two novels also follow disparate characters who come together. So in Mrs. Dalloway, they come together when they all look up at a skywriting planes, an advert written in the sky. And in Ulysses, it's Dublin itself that connects the characters who bump or do not bump into each other on those shared streets. So the 19th century novel contained a lot of characters who knew each other, their relationships formed the drama of the narrative, and this is what we would call the conventional interlacing plot. Instead, in these 1930s novels, we're asked to observe each character on their distinct path and wait for the moment when they do or do not intercept. We see individuals failing to communicate with each other, often running away from any opportunity to communicate with each other. So the collective novel succeeded in dismantling the Protestant novel's fantasy of a beneficent social and moral order, but they did so by replacing that ordering capacity often with the collective idiom of popular culture. It is sometimes just the ads that people see in the sky or on billboards that are all that connects their otherwise lonely lives. Now, as soon as this genre emerged, it was accused of propagating hopelessness, of depicting a world too unrealistically devoid of meaning. Now, in response, John Summerfield in 1936 attempts to reconcile from a political position the collective and the individual. As a socialist, John Summerfield achieved this through a novel in which the characters are a large group of workers who come together in strike action after a major industrial accident. And a literary critic at the time said that unlike most novels of today, Summerfield's is alive with hope and a sense of direction. He shows us the nucleus of a society of the future, the Communist Party at work in factory and office, instilling a strength that it derives from the one clear and courageous principle that the modern world has to offer a disillusioned generation. So at its most optimistic, the 1930s collective novel succeeded in breaking away from providentialism and individualism, but it did so by investing instead in class action, a social movement that brought people together for a shared cause, but did not sentimentalize their connectedness. This is a vision of how human relationships existed in modern society, but it was one that was only prepared to be moral within the political. It offered hope, but only in and through the human. Its heroes are those who are prepared to suffer personal loss, but only for the possibility of collective human reward. The collective novel had dismantled the bourgeois novel, but in doing so, it had denied all divine reality. And this is where we can bring in Houselander. That's the original cover, and this is ours. So she's a believer in the Christian God as transcendent reality, but she's also a woman who, like many of her atheist peers, observed the individual adventure of moral life as something that happens in the low, the unseen, the lonely and disparate lives of ordinary people. In depicting Catholic parish life in the 1940s, Houselander in fact draws on the techniques used by Summerfield in Mayday. We follow her characters on the earthly plane, where they do in fact perceive a failure of connection. They do feel lonely. Many of them have moments of consolation or conversion, but some of them only very faintly so. What's important is that we, as readers, are asked to see the events of the novel on the divine plane, away from human sight. And from there, we can see that the characters are in fact brought together by the divine reality that is made present through the liturgy. So where Summerfield was using class action to bring his characters together, Houselander uses the liturgy. And in this way, liturgy forms a really crucial structuring device, because it is something at the basic practical level that does structure our lives, our days and our weeks, but also it is precisely the event that exists on both the earthly and divine planes, and can therefore be depicted with a certain degree of realism. And this is where I think we can make an interesting case for the Catholic realist novel. This novel, for believers at least, remains very much a realist novel, even though we are occasionally asked to glimpse the angelic realm. Okay, I'm going to switch mode for a moment here and think with some theologians about the role of liturgy. The Church's prayer is not simply an expression of a pre-formed creed. David Fagerberg has said that liturgy is not just ritual, it is a way of living and a way of thinking expressed ritually. In other words, the liturgy is the faith of the Church in motion. Like listening is friendship in motion, or studying is scholarship in motion, or sitting down at supper together is family in motion. Liturgy is what Andrew Luth calls the amniotic fluid in which our knowledge of God takes form. In Houselander's novel, the liturgy frames the story, but it also frames the lives of the novel's central protagonists. Without this liturgical frame, we would just have an arbitrary collection of individual lives. Now, of crucial importance to the novel's use of the liturgy is the way that it animates scripture. The characters in the novel are all biblical figures, and at times their figuration can almost be heavy-handed from a literary point of view. I'm still working out what I think about that, but I think that from a theological point of view, this explicitness is actually necessary because of the work that Houselander is doing to show that scripture is animated in life through the liturgy, or we might say through the narrative form of the novel itself. From Gerard Lachlan, we have this description of the liturgy as interpretation of scripture. The biblical story is present not only in the readings of the lectionary, but in the very language of the liturgy, which through penitence and acclamation comes to focus on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The participants' absorption into the story is made possible through their absorption of the story in and through its ritual enactment. They are not simply witnesses of the story, but characters within it. Now, the most obvious biblical figure in Houselander's novel is the priest as a figure for Christ, but we also encounter characters who figure the Holy Family, Mary Magdalene, Paul, and the tax collector. And the novel asks us to see how these figurations cause change in other characters, even when they might not actually interact with each other socially. So the liturgy, it is the moments of liturgy in the novel that draw the biblical role of the characters into narrative unity, just as it draws their disparate and lonely lives into divine unity. The further we get into the novel, the more we realise, actually, that we're not just in London Docklands in the 1940s, we're also in biblical time, we're in all time. I'm going to read to you a passage from chapter 11, which is told through the eyes of the parish priest, the new parish priest. And it is in his chapters when we see parish life. We get a sense of community. We don't often meet the individual, the main characters in those moments. Instead, we just see his vision of the parish as a whole. So this is what I'm reading you as an example of community life of a multitude of characters, which is quite distinct from the other chapters in which we see an individual character only. So the parishioners are all coming together for a novena every day to pray for the healing of this little boy called Willie Jewell, and the healing is what they hope will prove that their priest is saintly. On the second day of the novena, Willie became so much worse that Martha, his mother, sent word to Father O'Grady asking him to come. A rumour had already gone round that the child was dying, and the prayers of the people rose in a crescendo. They crowded to the weekday benediction to pray together. Benediction was at 4. At 3:30, the church was full, the benches crowded, the people kneeling in the aisles. Even on Sunday nights or on the great feasts, there were seldom so many, although it is in benediction that hundreds find the only visible beauty that shines out on the drabness of their lives, like stars burning into a grey twilight. It is an easy and sweet ceremony, with the singing of hymns and the relief of prayers spoken out loud. The church was noisy. The people had come early because they were restless and unsettled. How could they remain quietly at home or at work while waiting for a miracle that was to break upon a moment of crisis? Everyone was whispering. Some stood at the back of the church in little knots, talking in murmurs. There was a continual tramping of feet as more and more came in. Each one who came was stopped in the aisle by an outstretched hand from the benches, 3, 4, or 5 times on their way up to their seat, and plied with eager, breathless questions. How is he? Have you news? Is he worse? They say he's sinking, have you heard? Lord, spare the child. Lord, pity the dying. What is the news of him? They say he's in agony. Have you any news of him? Christ be with him. Mother Mary, comfort him. Sweet child, Christ be with him. The organist, Miss Mulligar, an eccentric old lady whose want of balance was charitably attributed to her talent for music, was blowing up the organ. She invariably put ribbons in her hat according to the liturgical colours of the day, but for benediction, white. The organ wheezed and panted like a dragon coming round from an anaesthetic. Now and then, when a sudden gust of enthusiasm took Miss Mulligar, it lingered in a long wheeze, so like her usual tremulous opening bar to the O Salutaris that everybody flung onto their knees, only to find that there was nothing happening at all. The school children, allowed out early for the midweek benediction, came in whispering and jostling one another and fidgeted in the front benches like flocks of quarrelsome sparrows. Behind them, the Sisters of Charity with their great white coifs followed like a fleet of sailing ships riding proudly on calm waters. Presently, a boy came in bearing a star on a reed and began to light the candles on the altar. It was Jimmy Hogan, a tough child respected for his punch and the terror of the lads of his own size for miles around, but the friend of stray cats, dogs and sparrows, and known to the riverside sporting world as the best tiddler fisher of the century. But now he was indistinguishable from a young angel, blue-eyed, flaxen-haired, his face scrubbed to an apple rosiness, vested in a snowy white surplice. One by one, he lit the multitude of candles. It was as if he touched 1,000,000 buds in a celestial meadow with the Star of Bethlehem, and they bloomed with holy fire. Now and then he had to return to one that faltered, one that winked and flickered and had to be coaxed and petted into light. And everybody watched with absurd suspense, as when people listen to a singer in terror of nervous apprehension that his high note will not come off. When the stars were lit, the tensity, the expectation in the church was almost unbearable. The people could hardly wait now for the door of the tabernacle to be opened and the Lord to be borne out among them and lifted up. They were waiting with the same desire, doubt, hope, faith, with the same longing to believe, to be convinced, to see, with which the crowds in Jerusalem waited the coming of Christ in their narrow streets. The beating of their inarticulate hearts hammered on the leaf-light door of gold. Lord, that I might see, Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. At last, the bell rang out, a sudden clatter of silver over the heads of the people, and they flung down on their knees to stay on them. Books and rosaries and pennies were dropped. Some last comers clattered in at the double and threw themselves down with such violence that it seemed they might break the bench. The organ, with a sustained wail, like the escape of a captive beast at the last gasp of life, began the O Salutaris in earnest. The congregation were not singers. Usually there would be just one robust old man letting off his rage at the tepidity of the others in a tuneless roar, and one tremulous old lady, quite unconscious of the others, uttering a quavering solo, but for the rest, only a few moans and false starts. Father O'Grady, who would have liked a good volume of sound, had to console himself with the old saying, "Where there are many hymns, there is much heresy." But today, everybody sang. It was the loudest and most tuneless, the most reckless, the most unself-conscious, the most fervent singing that had ever been heard in Father O'Grady's church. It seemed impossible to him that with such intensity, such wheezing and roaring and sighing and sweating in prayer, the miracle would not be granted this afternoon. Okay, I think there is a question that remains open about the extent to which Houselander is recuperating both the individual and the omniscient voice of the 19th century novel. I think she does so through these liturgical moments, because it's in these moments that the individual, from a Christian point of view, a properly unique, beloved creature, needs to be allowed space in the novel. And also the omniscient voice is required at moments for her to enable us to see the divine vision. But it's important that she brings these two things together only in these moments of liturgy. There are three main masses in the book. The initial Requiem Mass for the dead priest. Then the climax of the novel is a high mass. And then at the end of the novel, a low weekday mass. And it's important that very few people are at that final weekday mass, the lonely and more ordinary unseen mass, because it's there that we're shown how even the absent people are drawn into the drama of the liturgy in a way that is mysterious and incarnational. This quiet weekday mass, in fact, provides the consolation needed by the characters in the novel, even if they can't fully see it for themselves. On the earthly plane, the participants are shown to be tired, soiled, distracted, disappointed, and the new parish priest is full of self-doubt. But, we're told by the novel, since Christ was present in them, the whole Christian world was there. What appeared as a cluster of insignificant and broken lives is in fact the breaking of the bread. Here in this final mass, the narrative voice shifts away from the individual point of view to find a much wider register. It asks us to hear the collective yearning of the whole community, but their cry becomes the timeless cry of all people, not just London parishioners in the 1940s. It becomes the cry of the people below the cross at Calvary. I'm going to read, there's Gerard. Here we are. This is just the last quote I'm going to give you from this final mass. A cry rose from all over the frightened world. Come down from the cross if you're the Son of God. Save yourself and us too if you're the Christ. But Christ remained on the cross. His fingers closed on the nails. The crown of thorns was in flower. The 5 ribs, like the 5 fingers of the world's pain, gripped his heart, and his heart broke open, and the river of the world's life flowed out of it. Come down, come down, come down. But Christ did not come down from the cross. The life of Riverside went on. The day's work had begun. A ship was coming in from the sea, another was putting out. An old man was dying, and a child was being born. The little server rang his silver bell. The people bowed down low. Time stopped. Father O'Grady was lifting up God in his large, chapped hands. Christ remained on the cross. The blood and sweat and tears of the world were on his face. He smiled, the smile of infinite peace, the ineffable bliss of consummated love. So even if the characters themselves remain without consolation, even if their desire to see Christ step down from the cross is never fulfilled, we are given access to the reality that on the cross, Christ's promise is fulfilled for us. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I think we can pick up some more of this in conversation, I hope. But I will just close by claiming, I think, for Houselander, I think she is the first English novelist, possibly the first novelist in any language, to unite modernist literary techniques with the doctrinal reality of Christian life as something that is lonely, even when there is consolation, a life that is fallen and redeemed, a life that is both unseen and loved. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bonnie, for what I think for many of us will have been an introduction to these novels. And it's such a significant and important introduction, not just to Christian literary studies, but actually to modernism as a whole. We've spent the last 20, 25 years in English literature departments trying to broaden the canon, trying to widen participation and hear a wide number of voices, as wide a number of voices as possible. What's missing, particularly in modernism, I would say, are these Catholic voices. So it's extremely significant, and thank you very much indeed for that. Can I open the floor to questions? Yes, at the back.
I was just wondering whether you talked about group action and socialism and how the divine disappeared when that came along in Mayday and other novels like that. And I was wondering whether it had something to do with some religious thinking that the class system, inequity, social injustice are ordained by God.
Yeah, I should stand back here so I'm heard, shouldn't I? Yeah, I think that Houselander would probably agree. We have her biography to go on. She wasn't a joiner, so she was frequently helping out various causes. A lot of lay Christian organisations emerged in the interwar period and post-war period, and she always contributed things. She wrote for them and she did what she could, but she wasn't a joiner. She was rather awkward socially. She had a lovely group of friends. She would have been a terrific friend. I'd have loved to know her, to have known her. She was very involved in organisations that were emerging in the period. We don't have her views on specific movements like the communist movement. She may have had exchanged letters with them. She has copious correspondence, and I've not read all of it. But I'd say that she was very ready to see that as an important part of the Christian life. Yeah.
Thank you for that. It was absolutely fascinating. I was very interested by the two extracts you put up of Houselander. I mean, the first one with the benediction, the tone was comedic, which is fascinating. But the last one, the tone was much more somber. It was almost moving to a kind of tragic sort of melancholy. And yet, of course, it couldn't be in the end because Christ ultimately was looking down. But I wonder if you'd care to comment on that.
Yeah. Yes, it's true. She moves very skillfully between moments of great humour. I was very willing to suspend my critical hat when I first read it, and I spent most of the time weeping or laughing. It is a terrific novel. And she uses those turns very well, I think. So even in the benediction moment, she moves very quickly at that moment when I finished on their longing for the miracle. She moves then very quickly to the more sombre note in their desires. And I mean, my favourite works of literature are able to use those two registers as well, because I think they are so essential to the Christological worldview, that we can carry them together and that they can emphasise each other's extreme ends. You know, I think that well-handled literature should be able to make the most of that interesting extent of human experience. But yeah, well noted. And the liturgical moments are particularly full with them. But I would say even when we meet the individual characters, sometimes their stories they're really tough. They're actually very difficult reading. And there is a lot of, it is quite a melancholy novel actually. And she plays very carefully, and the theology of the way that she plays very carefully about the melancholy is something I haven't had time to expand on, but Julia is very good on this. She does often get quite close to possibly sanctifying suffering to an extent that is not recuperated, but I think she does draw it in at the end, always through her use of this description of the divine plane, which is really tricky. I mean, to pull that off as a novelist, to describe the heavenly realm in a way that is convincing is really hard, but that's what she uses so that we can retain some hope in this really, it's a very difficult parish to live in at that time in London. Yeah.
Bonnie, thank you very much indeed. I'm just thinking in light of Claire's paper yesterday, in which we were invited to think about the portrayal of Mary Magdalene, whether across the novels you've worked on and edited so far in the series, whether you found types of Mary Magdalene figures, and if so, how have they been treated by these women writers?
Yeah, there are. So there's a Mary Magdalene figure in this novel, a young Irish woman who washes dishes in a restaurant and struggles to stay away from the drink. She's terrific, and she too is really quite downtrodden. But she is one of the most devoted to this little boy who's dying. So we see the real tenderness in her. And she's also takes on the Magdalene role in her distant dedication to the priest. She's not particularly pious, but she's often aware of where he is and what he's doing and where he's moving around as he weaves through their lives. She's sort of clocked him now and then, which I find is really interesting. Yeah, I'd say we could probably say with almost certainty that almost every novel by these women contains a figure, quite a few. I mean, that's why they're wonderful, because they're often novels in which we get a full range of female lives being explored. And so I'd say we often get Mary Magdalene in different versions. We see a whole terrific range of nuns. Kate O'Brien's Land of Spices, I couldn't get that. Penguin have got that, or Virago, one of the most beautiful Catholic novels I've ever read. A Belgian order in Ireland in the 30s, and we follow the mother of the house and the youngest student, two women at either end of life who are agents of divine grace for each other. And we get the full spectrum of life in that one convent. It's terrific. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of scholarship to be done, actually, given that this work has pretty much been absent from any literary study at all in the last 100 years, which is the discipline that we were schooled in and raised in. We're only just at the beginning of starting to work up a scholarly field of these works. Yeah.
Thank you, Bonnie. That was exceptional and interesting, and I'm grateful for your introduction of these writers to us. I couldn't help but think, this is more a comment than a question, or a comment disguised as a question, but I was thinking of Virginia Woolf in a particular way as one of these secular, agnostic, atheist writers that she'd be in dialogue with. And I think of two dinner parties in Mrs. Dalloway that she's preparing for, and Mrs. Ramsay and To the Lighthouse, as sort of a secular liturgy. And that's what they would have, what she would have available to her. But it struck me as sort of these important meals, sort of reflecting kind of a secular liturgy. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Or...
Yes, yeah. And in fact, one of the, obviously when you're defining the terms of a series like this, you have to draw the line somewhere. But we're forever having to question woman, Catholic, writer. So at the moment we're establishing the series with the most obvious examples, like these phenomenal women that you don't know why we forgot them. But I'm hoping that once it's established, there'll be an opportunity to bring in novels that break the mold a little, because in fact I think one of the really interesting ways of reading literature with a Catholic or a Christian eye is precisely where it's embedded and is and in moments of coming together like that. I think I can. Yes, I do. uncertain about whether I'm going to say this with certainty, but yes, I do think that in novels by women, we tend to get a much deeper investment in the material as a source of grace or sanctity, or sometimes even a sacramental sense that baking bread, having babies, feeding people takes on a certain sacramental quality, possibly. So a lot of the novels that we're bringing out, one next year is the first 1980s Troubles novel that we've managed to get rights to by Mary Beckett. It's called Give Them Stones. The Catholicism is not explicit, but she's a woman who's baking bread to try and feed her Belfast community. But the action of the baking of the bread for them is a way of keeping the rebels at bay, and a way of meaning that there's a space on the end of the street where the women can gather for 5 minutes in the morning and gossip and buy the bread. And that way it sort of starts to stand in as something almost liturgical. Yeah. So I think, yes, being able to, once we can establish this as a sort of new canon, I think it will have much more of a vocabulary to start looking at more traditional modernist texts like Woolf and say, look at this other stuff that's going on. Yeah.
Thank you for that wonderful paper and for reading this humoristic but also deeply moving account of benediction. Obviously, that would be typical of many parishes pre-Vatican II, whereas this kind of devotional life, because in a way it's more devotional than liturgical, or at least both, is now absent from our parishes. And what would a Catholic writer, or whether male or female, have to dig into today to bring about such a rich imagination with or is that kind of, you're reviving these novels, but they harken back to times that are bygone, and we're not going back to that? I'm interested if you've got any intention of publishing also contemporary Catholic women writers or not.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, we have a set of writers from the end of the 20th century. The labour involved with accessing rights to later writers has gone on for years. So it's harder to get them, but we've managed to secure quite a few. And so actually there is a case to be made for the postmodern Catholic novel. Muriel Spark is already in print, right? Many of us read her when we were young, but we probably didn't realise how Catholic the novels are. And Alice Thomas Ellis, who I love, very inspired by Muriel Spark. Really clever, very witty novels, women as well, very witty women. These are difficult novels, actually. And I think that's what the joy in those novels. They are demanding intellectually, so the work, a comparable kind of work that we might see here in a realist depiction of pre-V2 parish life, is going on in this very witty realm within the postmodern novel, and there's definitely, we're trying to make a case for that as well. So one of the things we're trying to do is to broaden the terms and the historical bracket of the Catholic literary revival. Catholic novels are still being written. They never stopped being written. We think that they ended in the 60s because apparently Vatican II meant we were no longer in a position of difference from society, and so there was no need for the Catholic novel, but that's just not true. I mean, David Lodge he's one that he charts the whole century for us in his novels, doesn't he? So I think that definitely in the 80s and 90s, we see a different kind of novel that is using different strategies, but is similarly innovative. Spark and Ellis were at the forefront of postmodern literary technique, so clever, and they really need a lot of scholarship to untangle what they're doing, but they're using the methods of their day. Houselander is very much situated in the 30s and 40s. That scene is an innovative scene. As much as it's an easy read and a joy to read, it is also technically an innovation. But the 80s and 90s writers are right there in the postmodern novel, so yeah.
Thank you, Bonnie. That was a wonderful introduction. The passages about liturgy, and particularly about the Eucharist, made me think of other ways in which in other Catholic and some Anglican novels, the narration of the Eucharist, the insertion of a Mass somewhere in the story, has perhaps more significance than people would immediately realize, because it seems as if that narrating of the Mass, particularly in the last extract you read, becomes almost a way of ironizing the obvious story, saying that you may not know it, but there is always another perspective on these lives that are being narrated, and it's the perspective of the crucified. And that is systematically hidden and obscure, but actually that is what the entire narrative business is about. It's putting it in that light, which will always be unclear. You just need to know it's there, because it doesn't go away. I'm tempted to rabbit on about other examples in other fiction, but I'm sure you know more of
Give me a
them,
list
because
later.
there are several, aren't there? And
Yeah.
that seems to be really, in a way, connected with the very literary technique of what's going on.
Yes, exactly. And it is important that we get that, we see the Mass in its fullness and we receive the consolation. I mean, we're the lucky ones because the characters still a lot of them are not there in that final Mass anyway. And even if they were, the ones who were there, we're shown they're quite distracted, they're tired. They're not necessarily the ones crying for Christ to come down from the cross. She says, the whole of the lonely world uttered its cry, the frightened world uttered its cry. So she's using the voice very carefully there to show us that this reality is in the world, but the characters themselves that you've just invested 7 hours in following, they don't see it. You know, it's a clever balancing act there, I think. But she gives it to us. So we're the recipients of the gift in the novel. Yes. So my training is actually in early modern drama. I'm a Shakespeare scholar, and we do a lot of work on what happened to the popular theatre after the banning of biblical drama, when it became a very serious heresy to depict any of the sacraments on stage, where once they would have been part of regular annual community observance, to be out in the street dramatising the biblical narratives and the sacraments as part of the same festival. So there's a lot of really great theories actually on how liturgy is worked or not worked or semi-worked or ironically worked into the human need for narrative, right? We need story, but at that moment in history, we see that the stories have been forced to be emptied of the divine reality. So we find often in secular drama in early modern London a kind of yearning for a certain sort of ritual that has to be constructed in different ways. I think there is room here for a developed body of theory about narrative prose and what's happening when we narrate the liturgies and the sacraments in particular in this mode, and how we are participating in it as readers, in that it's not an embodied experience like we would get in the theatre or in the church, or is it? I don't know. But it is, we're being invited into the Mass in a way. Yeah. We come here and then we'll go.
Thank you for that. It's absolutely fascinating. It's raised a whole load of different questions. But to follow on from that thing about the last Mass in the Dry Wood, where you said we were the lucky ones, we got the consolation, but the other people didn't. I mean, I think isn't that really part of it? In that the consolation is there, not everybody sees it. It's like in the Psalms, where the psalmist often talks about, I am calling to the Lord, and the Lord has or will grant my request, but it's not necessarily, the consolation doesn't necessarily come within the time frame of the psalm. And I think in the story that you tell of all these people, these Catholic parishioners praying for the miracle for the little boy, you can see that it's very, very familiar. I mean, I'm old enough to remember parish life in the 1950s, the kind of enjoyment, really, of a Catholic congregation praying like mad and having a good sing and everything, because they really, they really feel strongly about this thing. But I mean, the same thing happens in many a demonstration for something, for somebody being killed or whatever it may be. There is that enjoyment. It doesn't stop it being, it doesn't stop it being a holy kind of enjoyment in a way. But later on,
you don't, because I think there's a male and female thing here. You don't get men enjoying that kind of thing with Green and War. It's almost as if their feeling of faith in God, in Catholicism, is like a rather horrible imperative put on them that they have to follow. And there is a kind of joy. I mean, right at the end of Brideshead Revisited, where there's that business with the altar lamp. And Charles Ryder kind of reflects that this lamp has shone, through the Crusades and all sorts of really quite questionable things. But there's a kind of joy. And similarly, Alice Thomas Ellis looks at it from a kind of ironic thing. But I mean, I think the point I wanted to make was that there is this gap between the joy that is there and other people's inability to see it. And that can sometimes be what Catholics think of, or used to think, of a hostile society. Certainly in the 1940s, I think a lot of Catholic excitement and fervour was encouraged by their feeling, especially in a place like Docklands, that they were surrounded by enemies. And certainly I think this was the case in the 1950s. I mean, I don't know what you think about that, but I do think there is this dichotomy between the two feelings, that's all.
Yeah, so the dichotomy in the sense of the slightly gendered narrative structure there, yes, but also the tension in that consolation is depicted, pointed to, but shown to not necessarily be seen, realised, received by characters, which is real life. Yeah. Yes, I think that handled by many of the women that we're bringing back in print, that is depicted in a community setting. That does seem to be one of the distinctions, I would say, that we see Catholic life in a community, often a street or a village or one parish like this. I mean, I've never read another depiction of parish life like that. So we, that they're using what was, I mean, that, so the emergence of the novel, it did tend towards a kind of location, but we did also often follow one person's suffering. So even in early, I'm thinking of Defoe, he's got one female character whose trajectory we're following, and she's usually suffering to the end, right? But we still see her in the collective. So I do think in the novel, there is the capacity for both the kind of Wall Green suffering, Catholic up against it, and this community dynamic. They're both seeded in the emergence of the form, but they do tend to be, I think, explored slightly differently. And one of the richnesses of bringing this stuff back is that we see, okay, actually the field is much bigger than we thought, so we can start to make observations like that. That there are certain patterns that tended to suit women writing in certain periods, certain patterns that tended to suit men writing in these periods, and where did they come from? Did they emerge from social conditions of the writer, the political and literary moment of their decade, but we need to see the full set of novels in order to start to make those observations, and we just simply haven't been reading them all, so.
Thank you, Bonnie. This is just really fascinating and just really clear and excellent, and a novel I have to read. So thank you for the dry wood. I had a question and a comment. The question was kind of answered by Nicholas. You're about the postmodern or the post-Vatican II kind of Catholic imagination and how that might get played out in different scenes and structures and contexts. But in my own thoughts and my work, it's this. I wanted to see what you thought of this. It's almost as if these modernist writers have to outdo modernism, right? They're like, oh yeah, well, you've got this, Ulysses, I'm going to do this, a kind of a sense of both proving themselves, but also having the facility or the tool, the resources to do it out of this kind of Catholic or Christian resource. So any comment on that as you look at these novels?
Yeah, I would say that all of the novels that I'm working with, I see them looking at the novels coming out. They're readers, right? These are readers. So they've spent the last 1 or 2 decades reading everything that's being printed, which was possible back then. Now it's impossible, but back then you could actually read everything that was published. And they've clearly studied them. Josephine Ward as well. She uses a completely different technique in every novel, different voice, different structure. She was really very experimental. She has one hilarious satirical novel about marriage that I just can't wait to bring in print. It's so funny. But it's very modern as well. By then she's at the end of her career, and it's a very clever, very canny interleaving of 2 plots. So they're absolutely reading what's around, and like us thinking, well, what's missing? The Christian life is missing. The Christian life as I know it is missing. So I'm going to use the techniques that are being developed and push them in a direction that enables me to contribute the thing that is missing, which I find phenomenal. From a critical point of view, that's great, because we're able to make a case for them in the literary world as well, but I definitely think that they're all doing that. Sheila K. Smith, she's an interesting one because she was known as a Sussex author, so she wrote a ridiculous number of very large, very popular Sussex farming novels. She churned them out at a rate, I don't know how she did it, considering she wrote them all by hand from beginning to the end with very little editing. She didn't have children to interrupt her, but she used to just sit at her kitchen table, doing this. And so she was known as the Sussex farming author. She was High Anglican. She was very involved in the High Anglican movement. Her and her husband used to lecture on the circuit. They took over from the Chestertons when the Chestertons converted, and then very late in their life, they also converted. So in fact, it wasn't until the end that she wrote a Catholic novel. And she isn't quite as technically innovative as the others, but you see her working with her own canon, because by then she's established one. So she's having to work through her own techniques and use them in a new light. And what's interesting about her is after she did that, she stopped writing altogether. And instead she sort of she lived her novel. She moved back to Sussex, bought a farm. There was no parish for 9 miles, so she set one up. And then she just ran parish life in the countryside. And she wrote other things, pamphlets about the saints, but it was almost as though she had realised the final novel. She did the thing she needed to do, produced the Catholic version of her own technique, and then job done. She just lived this quiet, or not so quiet, life of rural observance and being a kind of matriarch to the local community. So it's interesting. Each life has played out slightly differently. But yeah, on the whole, I'd say they're definitely working with the most up-to-date techniques.
Just want to pick your wonderful brains a bit further.
Sure.
Is this working?
Yeah.
Good. To do with a dimension of High Anglicanism and Anglo-Catholicism, in which I've always been interested, namely the Maurice Reckitt Christendom, Canon de Mant, Conrad Noel, that a strand of what I would call Catholicism, as it were, with a small c, which was concerned with, it was bohemian, as in interested in the dance, the ballet, in Maurice Reckitt's case, croquet and test matches and croquet and all that kind of, and it was certainly interested in Robert Elsmere and Mrs. Humphrey Ward. I don't know if there's any relationship there. The best-selling novel in the 19th century.
No, they're not related. They were often confused, but they're not related yet.
Good, that goes on. But whether it would be possible to know whether these Christian sociologists, these Pauline Kingdom Christian sociologists, were either writing or reading. Do you know anything about them from a fictional point of view?
Yes, I think they were all reading each other, and often they knew each other. In and around London, literary salons were really frequent events when people of all sorts of denominations got together. Josephine Ward used to run a lecture series and a lunch club at Westminster Cathedral for people of all faiths and none, called Modern Catholic Thinkers or Modern Christian Thought or something. And the point was to get everybody together, even well-known skeptics or outright anti-Christian speakers, and to get everybody around the table to talk about the main issues of the day. So I do think they were reading each other and they were in conversation. And I would hope that when we get the series established, there is room for bringing in Sayers and other really great Christian writers, but I have to kind of allow the press to get its brand settled before I do that. But there are a lot of really, the novels were some of the ways that they were asking the questions that they were having, the conversations that they were having around the table were then being posed in novel form. So as ever with the novel, I think there's a way of thinking about it as being produced out of coterie. Newman, you can track Josephine Ward's novels and her husband's biographies alongside Newman's work because they were meeting weekly and discussing the ideas that they were working through at the time and then going off and writing in their studies and coming back again. And you can see their ideas are kind of keeping track with the conversation that they were having. So yes is the answer. Yeah.
Can I ask you once again to thank Bonnie for such a wonderful